the silent tide. It was late August of 2008 when I first set foot in Riverton, a small coastal town with more stories than its winding streets would let on. I had just started my first year at Riverton College, excited for the new chapter in my life. Sharing a cramped dorm room with me was my old buddy from high school, Ben, who had a peculiar habit of hoarding every item he could possibly need, or so it seemed. One Saturday afternoon, after spending hours cleaning the dorm, I suggested to Ben, "Hey, do you want to get out? Maybe head to the beach for a walk?" Ben, who was buried under a pile of clothes and textbooks, barely looked up. "Not today, man. Too much stuff to organize. You go ahead." I had always lived in the Highlands, far from any coastline. The allure of the sea was something I'd longed for. Riverton's proximity to the ocean was one of the reasons I had chosen this college. With a hopeful heart, I grabbed my beach towel and headed out alone, eager to soak in the salty air and the endless horizon. The sun was beginning its descent as I arrived at Riverton Beach. The sight was nothing short of breathtaking. The sun cast a golden hue over the water, and the sea breeze was refreshingly cool. Seagulls cawed and swooped above, their wings cutting through the orange sky. The rhythmic crash of the waves against the shore was a soothing symphony. I wandered along the beach, my feet sinking into the soft, warm sand. I marveled at the scene, as if it were a dream brought to life. As twilight approached, I found a large, smooth boulder and sat on it, gazing at the horizon. The setting sun painted the sea with shades of crimson and purple, blending into a tranquil masterpiece. Time seemed to stand still. 2 hours later, the sun had vanished, and the first stars began to twinkle. Temperature dropped and I started to shiver. As I prepared to leave, something caught my eye. The beach behind me seemed oddly different, as if parts of it had been swallowed by the sea. The realization hit me. Tide was coming in. I stood up and walked cautiously toward the water. The waves were rising faster than I anticipated. The water was now up to my waist, and the current felt stronger. Panic began to set in. I dashed back towards the shore, trying to avoid getting too soaked. A sudden wave crashed over me, drenching me completely and causing a sharp pain in my foot. I looked down to find a deep cut, but the urgency of the situation kept me from dwelling on it. I scrambled out of the water, my clothes sticking to my skin, and hurried back to the dorm. Ben was lounging on his bed when I burst through the door, dripping wet. "You went to the beach?" he asked, staring at my sodden state. "You look like you took a dive." Before I could respond, Ben's face turned ashen. Stammered, There was a woman. Behind you, I saw her." I was too exhausted and cold to process his words. "What are you talking about?" "There was a woman with long hair and a yellow dress. She was right behind you," Ben insisted, his voice trembling. I turned around, half expecting to see someone, but the room was empty. "You must be seeing things," I said, trying to dismiss his concern. "Maybe I just caught a cold or something." The next few days were a blur. I woke up the following morning with a raging fever and aching all over. My body felt like it was burning from the inside out. Ben was visibly worried as I lay in bed, shivering uncontrollably. By the third day, he and a few classmates rushed me to a nearby hospital. The doctors were baffled by my condition. I had a high fever that wouldn't break and was bedridden with pain. The local news was on in the hospital room, and Ben sat beside me, watching with a distracted gaze. An emergency report was unfolding. "Authorities have discovered the body of a young woman who drowned at Riverton Beach," the anchor announced. "She was found a week after she went missing. Clothing was described as yellow, and she had long hair." Ben's eyes widened, and he glanced at me nervously. "That's the woman I saw," he whispered. My heart pounded in my chest. I began to piece together the events. The area where the woman's body was found was the same part of the beach where I had been trapped. It was too much to ignore. The idea that I had come into contact with a ghostly presence was chilling. I tried to push the thoughts away, focusing instead on getting better. By the fourth day, fever started to wane, and my condition improved. But the sense of dread lingered. The ghostly woman's appearance and the eerie connection to my illness left me shaken. The years passed, and while I graduated and moved on, memory of that night never truly faded. I continued to visit the beach in Riverton, drawn to its beauty but haunted by the experience. Each visit was a bittersweet reminder of the sea's allure and its hidden dangers. Riverton's beach was more than just a picturesque location. It was a reminder of the thin veil between the living and the dead. The water, while inviting, held secrets beneath its surface. Secrets that had once ensnared me in its silent embrace. And though I tried to leave that part of my life behind, I knew that Riverton's beach would always hold a piece of my past. Place where the waves whispered stories of the unknown, and where the tides of fate once nearly claimed me. It was late 2019 when Ken Roberts and his colleague, Kevin Kip Barnes, set out on a business trip to a small town in the suburbs of Massachusetts. The job was straightforward: visit a local factory, assess the site, and return to their Boston office with the report. They were both in their early 20s, enjoying the perks of working for a growing tech company that occasionally sent them on these trips. They had been friends since college, and trips like this usually felt like mini vacations, a break from their routine. The day had been uneventful, the factory inspection going off without a hitch. They wrapped up by late afternoon and decided to head back to Boston before nightfall. But as they drove down Route 89, a long and winding road known for its dense forests and lack of streetlights, the mood began to shift. "I swear, this place always gives me the creeps," Kip muttered, glancing out the window as the sun dipped below the horizon. Ken chuckled, trying to lighten the mood. "What? Scared of a few trees, Kip? You know these rural roads are like this. It's just the countryside." Kip wasn't amused. He leaned forward, squinting into the growing darkness. "It's not just that. Have you heard the stories about this road?" Ken raised an eyebrow, curious. "Stories? Like what?" Kip hesitated before speaking, as if unsure whether he should bring it up. "People say this road is haunted, especially around here. You know, the whole ghost woman walking the road thing. Lots of accidents happen on this stretch, and the locals blame it on her." Ben rolled his eyes. "Come on, Kip. Ghosts? Really? You've been watching too many horror movies." "I'm serious," Kip insisted. "There's something about this place that just feels off." Ken didn't respond right away. The road ahead was now completely dark, with only the car's headlights cutting through the inky blackness. The trees seemed to close in on them, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Even Ken, usually the skeptic, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. They had been driving in silence for a while when Ken suddenly slowed down. Up ahead, barely visible in the weak beam of the headlights, was the figure of a girl walking on the side of the road. She was dressed in what looked like business attire, a short skirt and a blouse, her slim figure moving slowly in the dark. "Do you see that?" Ken asked, his voice low. "Yeah," Kip replied, his eyes fixed on the girl. "What's she doing out here? It's the middle of nowhere." Ken's first instinct was to offer her a ride. "Maybe she's lost or something. Let's ask if she needs help." Kip hesitated but nodded. "Yeah, okay, but be careful." Ken honked the horn lightly, trying to get her attention. The girl didn't respond. She didn't even turn around. Confused, Ken honked again, this time a little louder. Still nothing. "Maybe she didn't hear us," Kip suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. Ken pulled the car closer to her, rolling down his window. "Hey, do you need a ride?" called out. The girl kept walking, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she didn't even hear them. Kip leaned forward, squinting at her through the windshield. "What the hell?" Suddenly, Kip's expression changed. His face drained of color and his voice trembled. Ken, look at her face." Ken turned to see what Kip was talking about. As the car drew closer, the girl's face came into view, illuminated by the headlights. But what they saw wasn't the face of a lost girl. It was something out of a nightmare. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were nothing but black, empty socket. Blood trickled down from her eyes and mouth, her expression vacant and horrifying. Ken slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding in his chest. "What the hell?" Kip was shaking, his voice barely a whisper. "It's her. It's the ghost." The girl suddenly stopped walking and turned to face them fully. Her head tilted unnaturally to one side, as if her neck was broken, and her blood-stained mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. Kip screamed, "Go! Get us out of here, Ken!" Ken didn't need to be told twice. He slammed his foot on the gas, the tires screeching as the car sped down the road. But as they drove, the girl didn't disappear into the distance like a normal person would. Instead, she seemed to be right behind them, a figure growing larger in the rearview mirror. "Is she following us?" Ken asked, his voice filled with disbelief and terror. Kip looked over his shoulder, his eyes wide with fear. Yes, she is. Faster, Ken, faster." Ken pushed the pedal to the floor, car roaring down the dark road. But no matter how fast they went, the girl was always there, just out of reach, her hollow eyes locked on them. After what felt like an eternity, Ken spotted a rest stop up ahead. Without thinking, he swerved into the parking lot, slamming on the brakes. Car skidded to a halt. Both men scrambled out, gasping for breath. Kip's legs were shaking so badly that he could barely stand. He leaned against a tree, his chest heaving. What the hell just happened? Ken was equally shaken but tried to keep it together. "I don't know, man, but we need to get out of here. Let's just take a minute and then we'll keep going." Kip nodded, though he was still clearly terrified. Yeah, okay." The rest stop was eerily quiet, the only sound being the rustling of leaves in the cold night air. The forest surrounding them was dense and dark, trees blocking out what little moonlight there was. Everything felt wrong, like they were being watched. Ken looked around, trying to spot anything unusual. But the only thing that stood out was the oppressive silence. "You good, Kip?" Kip nodded, though he was visibly shaken. "Yeah, I just need to, you know." Ken understood and gave him some space. Kip walked a few feet away, standing behind a cluster of trees as he tried to calm himself. But as he stood there, the silence was broken by a low, eerie sound, a faint, unsettling moan that seemed to come from the depths of the forest. Kip froze, his heart racing. He slowly turned his head toward the source of the sound, and his blood ran cold. Emerging from the darkness of the trees was the girl, the same girl they had seen on the road. Now, she looked even more twisted, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Her head hung limply to one side, her eyes still bleeding, her mouth twisted into that same horrible smile. She was coming closer, her bare feet dragging along the ground, a yellow dress stained with blood. Kip couldn't move. His legs felt like they were rooted to the spot, his body paralyzed by fear. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The girl's pace quickened, her mouth opening wider, revealing blood-stained teeth. Just as she was about to reach him, Kip finally broke free of his paralysis. He turned and ran, his feet pounding the ground as he sprinted back to the car. "Ken, start the car. She's coming." Ken, who had been leaning against the car, smoking a cigarette, saw the terror on Kip's face, and knew he wasn't joking. He jumped into the driver's seat, fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life just as Kip threw himself into the passenger seat. Go, Kip screamed. Ken didn't need to be told twice. He slammed the car into gear and peeled out of the rest stop, tires screeching as they sped back onto the road. But as they looked back, they saw her again. The girl was standing in the middle of the road, her bloody face illuminated by the car's taillights. "She's still there," Kip whispered, his voice trembling. Ken didn't answer. He was too focused on getting them as far away from this place as possible. But no matter how fast they drove, the image of the girl stayed with them, haunting their thoughts, their fears. They were almost halfway back to Boston when Kip's phone buzzed. It was a message from their boss, asking for an update on the trip. Kip's hands were still shaking as he typed out a quick response, trying to keep his mind off what had just happened. Ken was driving in silence, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. The road ahead was dark and empty, with nothing but the headlights cutting through the night. But even in the silence, both men couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Kip looked over at Ken, his voice barely above a whisper. Do you think she's gone?" Ken didn't answer right away. Kept his eyes on the road, his mind racing. "I don't know, Kip. I don't know." As they rounded a bend in the road, Ken and Kip saw it. An unexpected sight that made both of their hearts skip a beat. There, in the middle of the road, stood the girl again. Her figure was faintly illuminated by the headlights, her long hair hanging in matted, bloodied strands. Her yellow dress fluttered eerily in the wind, the blood stains now dark and almost black under the car's lights. Ken's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Not again," he muttered, his voice shaking. Kip's eyes were wide with terror. She's still here. How is this even possible? Ken tried to slow down, but the brakes squealed in protest as he tried to control the car. The girl remained motionless, her empty eye sockets fixed directly on them. As they drew closer, Ken's heart raced, and he could feel the cold sweat pooling at his back. "Ken, don't stop," Kip said urgently. "Keep going, she's going to—" Before Kip could finish, the girl moved. It was a sudden, jerky motion, almost as if she were glitching through the space. Her head tilted unnaturally, her mouth opening wide in a grotesque scream. The sound was a nightmarish mix of gurgling and wailing that pierced the car's cabin, causing both men to flinch. Ken's instincts kicked in, and he accelerated, aiming to go around her. But just as he was about to steer past, the girl lunged at the car. Her body collided with the front bumper. The impact was so violent that the car jolted sideways. "Watch out," Kip shouted, grabbing the dashboard as the car swerved uncontrollably. Ken fought with the steering wheel, desperately trying to regain control. The headlights caught a glimpse of the girl's twisted, contorted form as she was flung through the air. She landed hard on the road behind them, but as Ken looked back, she was already up and moving again, her pace unnaturally fast. The car hit something. Ken barely had time to register it before the front end of the vehicle slammed into a power pole. The force of the collision caused the car to crumple, the windshield shattering into a spiderweb of cracks. Sparks flew as the car came to a sudden stop, the engine sputtering and dying. Ken and Kip were thrown forward by the impact, their heads banging against the steering wheel and dashboard. Both men were dazed, their breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. Ken tried to open the driver's side door, but it was jammed. Kip was frantically trying to get his own door open, his face pale and streaked with sweat. "Ken, we need to get out," Kip yelled, his voice hoarse. "She's coming." Ken struggled to free himself from the wreckage, his hands shaking as he finally managed to push the door open. He stumbled out of the car, head spinning. Kip followed, and the two of them scrambled away from the wrecked vehicle. As they looked back, the girl was there again, standing by the shattered windshield. Her head was tilted in a grotesque angle, her eyes still bleeding. Her mouth hung open, the blood staining her teeth and chin. She was moving toward them, her steps slow and deliberate, but there was an unnatural speed to her approach. Kip was nearly in tears. "Ken, run!" They fled into the forest, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as they pushed through the underbrush. The forest was dense and dark, the trees looming like silent sentinels. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig seemed amplified in the oppressive silence. The haunting wail of the girl echoed through the trees, sending shivers down their spines. Ken and Kip ran blindly, their only goal to put as much distance between them and the nightmare they had encountered. They stumbled through the woods, their minds racing with fear and confusion. After what felt like hours, they finally broke through the trees and found themselves on a dirt road. Ken's hands were trembling as he pulled out his phone, trying to call for help. But the signal was weak, and the call failed repeatedly. "This can't be happening," Ken muttered, his voice breaking. "We're completely cut off." Kip was sitting on the ground, his face buried in his hands. "I can't take this anymore, Ken. I'm losing my mind." Just then, they heard a new sound, an approaching vehicle. The headlights pierced through the darkness, and Ken's heart leaped with hope. They flagged down the car, and it screeched to a halt. The driver, a middle-aged man with a grizzled beard, rolled down the window. "You boys all right? What are you doing out here?" Ken tried to explain, his words coming out in a frantic rush. "We were driving on Route 89. We saw something terrible." Before he could finish, Kip looked up and froze. The girl was there again, standing by the roadside, not her bloodied face illuminated by the approaching vehicle's headlights. "No," Kip screamed. "She's here." Driver turned to look, his face going pale as he saw the apparition. "What the hell is that?" The girl began to move toward the car, her eyes locked onto the driver. In a horrifying display of supernatural force, she reached out a bloody hand toward. Driver screamed and slammed his foot on the gas, speeding away from the scene. Ken and Kip were left standing in the middle of the road, their minds reeling. The girl had vanished again, but the terror remained. They knew they couldn't stay here, not with the ghost still roaming the area. "We need to find help," Ben said. voice resolute. "Can't stay here." They continued down the road, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that they were being pursued by something they couldn't understand or escape. Each shadow, each rustle of leaves seemed to carry the promise of more horror. Eventually they reached a small town, where they managed to find help and report the incident. But when the police went back to the scene, they found nothing. No trace of the ghost girl, no sign of the car accident. The rest stop, power pole, and the forest all seemed to have returned to their normal, mundane state. Ken and Kip's story was dismissed as a bizarre accident, their claims of a ghostly encounter considered to be the result of shock and stress. But Ken knew the truth, and so did Kip. They had seen something beyond the realm of understanding, and it had changed them forever. The experience left Ken and Kip haunted. Kip, in particular, struggled with severe trauma. He began to see the girl in his dreams, her blood-stained face appearing in the darkest corners of his mind. He was plagued by night terrors, and his once vibrant personality faded into a shadow of fear and paranoia. Ken, too, found it hard to move on. The sight of the girl's face was burned into his memory, but he could never drive down Route 89 again without feeling a cold chill. Tried to move on with his life. The ghostly encounter remained a permanent scar on his soul. Years later, they both found themselves avoiding the road entirely, and stories of the ghostly girl on Route 89 continued to circulate among locals. Some said she was the restless spirit of a woman who had died in a tragic accident. Others claimed she was something far more malevolent. No matter what the truth was, one thing remained clear. Route 89 was never the same for Ken and Kip. The darkness of that road revealed a nightmare they could never forget, and the ghost girl's haunting presence would forever linger in their memories. And as the years passed, the legend of the ghostly girl on Route 89 grew. A chilling reminder of the terror that lurked in the shadows of the suburban night.
The dense canopy of the Appalachian forest loomed over Tim, Sarah, and Jake as they trudged through the mud, their boots slipping in the sodden ground. The air was thick with the earthy scent of wet leaves, and the distant rumble of thunder hinted at the storm's approach. Their earlier laughter and chatter had faded into tense silence as dark clouds rolled in, signaling a storm. What was supposed to be a serene weekend escape quickly turned into a battle against the elements. "Let's set up the tent here," Tim suggested, pointing to a flat area half hidden by overgrown bushes. His face was set with determination, though a flicker of concern was evident in his eyes. "Before the rain gets worse." Sarah glanced at the sky, her expression clouded with apprehension. "Are you sure this is a good spot? It looks like it could get really muddy." "We don't have much time," Jake interjected, his voice already raised to be heard over the growing wind. "We need to get out of this weather." The trio worked quickly, their movements growing increasingly frantic as the first drops of rain began to fall. The tent's poles were set up with hurried, almost frantic motion, and their fingers fumbled with the stakes as the drizzle turned into a torrential downpour. The wind howled, bending the trees and whipping the rain into a frenzy. "Tim, tighten that corner," Jake shouted, his face drenched as he struggled to secure one side of the tent. "It's gonna blow away if we don't." Within minutes, the tent was barely anchored when the storm hit with full force. Rain hammered down in sheets, the wind howling like a beast unleashed. The noise was deafening. The world outside seemed to dissolve into a blur of gray. "Let's split up to gather firewood and supplies," Jake proposed, shouting over the roar of the storm. His face was set with determination, though his eyes betrayed his anxiety. "Sarah, you check that way. Tim, you come with me." Tim nodded, casting a worried glance at Sarah as she headed toward the stream. The dense foliage shielded them from the worst of the downpour, but the ground was treacherous and slippery, each step a battle against the mud. "Stay safe," Tim called to Sarah as they disappeared into the trees. Tim and Jake struggled through the downpour, their attempts to gather firewood becoming increasingly futile as the rain turned the forest floor into a slippery quagmire. The trees loomed ominously, their branches groaning under the weight of the water, casting eerie shadows that danced in the dim light. "Let's hurry up," Jake said, his voice tight with urgency. He stumbled over a hidden root, barely catching himself. The tent's not going to stay dry forever. They found a few branches, but were soaked to the bone, their clothes sticking to their skin. The wind howled through the trees, amplifying the eerie sensation that something was lurking just beyond their vision. The rain fell in relentless torrents, and the occasional flash of lightning illuminated the forest in stark, frightening detail. As they made their way back, the ground beneath them suddenly gave way with a sickening crunch. Jake's eyes widened in shock as a sudden surge of water from a flash flood roared beneath them. He lost his footing and was nearly swept away by the rushing current. "Hold on," Tim yelled, grabbing Jake's arm with a desperate strength. He managed to pull Jake back, but the intensity of the water forced them to retreat, their attempts to salvage their precarious footing nearly in vain. Meanwhile, Sarah was at the edge of the stream, struggling to find dry wood. The water was rising rapidly, swirling with a ferocious intensity. Her eyes darted around nervously, and a loud crack made her freeze. A massive tree branch, dislodged by the flood, crashed into the water nearby, sending a wave crashing over her and soaking her to the bone. Back at the tent, the wind howled and rain pounded the fabric like a relentless drum. Tim and Jake stumbled back, their arms laden with firewood. Their faces were grim, their bodies shaking from cold and exhaustion. As they approached the tent, they noticed Sarah's spot was empty. "Sarah!" Tim shouted, his voice breaking with worry. "Where are you?" Panic set in as they realized Sarah had not returned. Their attempts to call out for her were swallowed by the wind and rain, the storm's fury amplifying their growing fear. "What if she got lost?" Jake's voice was strained. "We need to find her." After what felt like an eternity, Sarah finally staggered back to the tent, her movements unsteady and her clothes dripping with water. Her eyes were wide with fear, and her shivering form seemed almost ghostly in the dim light of the tent. She said nothing about what had happened, instead collapsing into the tent with an exhausted sigh. "Sarah?" Tim asked, his voice trembling. "Are you okay?" Sarah simply nodded, her eyes staring blankly at the ground. The coldness of her body made Tim and Jake uneasy, a gnawing discomfort settling in their chests. "We need to get a fire going," Jake said, trying to focus on something practical. "We need to dry off and warm up." Tim and Jake worked to get the fire started, their hands shaking as they fumbled with wet matches and kindling. Fire sputtered and crackled, its weak light barely dispelling the shadows that danced on the tent walls. As the night wore on, the storm showed no signs of letting up. Inside the tent, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Sarah's silence was unsettling. Her eyes remained distant and glazed over, as if she were trapped in a world of her own. Tim and Jake tried to keep the fire going, but it was a losing battle against the dampness, seemed to seep into everything. Chill ran through the tent, making them shiver despite the feeble warmth of the fire. The wind howled outside, its mournful wail mixing with the eerie creaks of the tent. Strange noises emanated from beyond the thin fabric, whispers carried on the wind, and the occasional snap of a twig seemed unnaturally loud. "Did you hear that?" Tim asked, his voice tinged with fear. He stared at the tent's walls as if expecting something to burst through. Jake nodded, eyes wide. "It's probably just the storm," he said, though his voice betrayed his unease. "We've been out in this weather too long." But as the hours passed, the sounds grew more distinct. Footsteps trudging through the mud, rustling leaves, and a low, mournful wail that seemed to pierce the night. Sarah's eyes flickered open briefly, her gaze fixated on a spot in the corner of the tent, her breathing shallow and erratic. "Sarah, are you all right?" Jake asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Sarah's gaze remained fixed, and she shook her head slowly, as if struggling to understand something beyond their perception. The next morning, the storm had abated, leaving the forest eerily quiet. The sky was a dull, oppressive gray, and the once bustling forest was now a silent, haunting expanse. Tim and Jake decided to search for any trace of Sarah's earlier whereabouts, their hearts heavy with a growing sense of dread. As they ventured towards the stream, the silence was occasionally broken by the distant call of a bird or the rustle of leaves. Jake stumbled upon a sight that made his blood run cold. Sarah's lifeless body wedged in a crevice by the water's edge, face contorted in a final expression of terror. What? What is this? Jake gasped, his mind racing as he stumbled back, his face ashen. Tim approached, his face paling as he recognized the unmistakable signs of death. "She's been dead for days," said, horror-stricken. Voice trembled, and he could barely bring himself to speak the word. We've been with a ghost." Jake's mind raced as he struggled to process the horrifying truth. He could hardly breathe as the reality sank in. They had been living with Sarah's ghost, unaware that she had been dead for days. The realization was almost too much to bear, each second feeling like an eternity of torment. "What do we do now?" Jake's voice was a whisper, the weight of their situation pressing down on him. Tim's eyes were distant, his face set with grim resolve. "We need to get out of here," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We need to leave this place." As Tim and Jake trudged back to the tent, the oppressive weight of their discovery hung heavily in the air. The storm had finally ceased, but a new storm brewed within them, one of dread and fear. The forest, once a refuge, now felt like a tightening noose around their throats. Their breaths came in ragged gasps as they entered the tent, seeking solace from the chilling truth they had just uncovered. Inside the tent, the temperature seemed to plummet further. The fire, now nothing more than a feeble flicker, did little to dispel the encroaching cold. Shadows danced grotesquely on the tent walls, elongating and twisting with every gust of wind outside. Tim and Jake exchanged uneasy glances, their minds still reeling from the sight of Sarah's lifeless body by the stream. Suddenly, the air grew colder still. The dim light from the fire cast an eerie glow, and a spectral presence began to take shape. Sarah's ghostly figure appeared before them, her face pallid and her eyes hollow, like two empty voids staring into their souls. The sight was both mesmerizing and horrifying, the presence filling the tent with an unearthly chill. "Sarah?" Jake's voice trembled, barely above a whisper. "What do you want from us?" Sarah's ghost remained silent, but extended a translucent hand, fingers beckoning them. The gesture was unmistakably clear. She wanted them to follow. Fear gnawed at their resolve, but a morbid curiosity compelled them to follow her spectral form. They ventured out into the forest, their every step crunching through the sodden leaves and mud. The once familiar woods seemed alien in the dim light, shadows twisting into menacing shapes as the canopy overhead swayed with an unseen wind. As they followed Sarah's ghostly form deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around them. The darkness grew more profound, the only illumination coming from the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the ghostly apparition. Their hearts raced, each crack of a branch or rustle of leaves making them flinch. Sarah led them to a rocky outcrop, a jagged formation of stones partially obscured by overgrowth. The area was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of the forest reduced to an unsettling silence. Tim and Jake exchanged anxious glances, their fear escalating with every step. "Why are we here?" Tim asked, his voice barely audible. "What's happening?" Jake's eyes widened as he noticed something peculiar about the rocks. His breath caught in his throat as he saw what lay within the dark crevice, a sight that made his blood run cold. The bodies of two people were wedged in the narrow gap between the rocks, their forms twisted and contorted. Their faces, though pale and lifeless, bore the unmistakable signs of death, wide, unseeing eyes and expressions frozen in terror. The sight was a ghastly reflection of their own fears, and the realization hit them like a physical blow. "No, this can't be." Jake's voice faltered, his face turning ashen as he recognized the familiar features of their own bodies. Tim stumbled back, his legs weak as he tried to comprehend the horror before him. "This is us. We're dead?" He gasped, his mind struggling to grasp the impossible truth. The weight of the realization bore down on them, crushing force that left them immobilized. The forest seemed to close in further, the trees now pressing against them like an inescapable prison. The ghostly figure of Sarah hovered nearby, her gaze filled with an empty sadness, as if she, too, were trapped in this nightmarish reality. In the midst of their terror, Tim and Jake understood that their entire experience had been an unending nightmare. The accident that had claimed their lives had also bound their souls to this forest, eternally haunted by the twisted reality of their deaths. As they stared into the faces of their dead selves, The forest around them seemed to become a living entity, dark, suffocating, and unyielding. The once comforting canopy of trees now felt like a shroud, suffocating them in their perpetual state of dread. The ghost of Sarah, now a tragic emblem of their shared fate, hovered as a constant reminder of the inescapable horror they were doomed to endure. In the chilling silence that followed, Tim and Jake came to terms with their fate. The haunting truth was inescapable. They were forever bound to the forest, trapped in an eternal nightmare, their souls forever haunted by the specter of their tragic accident.
It was a decision made on a whim, a spontaneous road trip to clear her mind and escape the monotony of everyday life. Emily had always been the type to plan everything meticulously, but after her recent breakup, she craved unpredictability, something to shake her out of the emotional rut she had fallen into. So, she packed a bag, filled her car's tank, and set out with no particular destination in mind. The open road felt liberating at first, with the wind in her hair and the sun setting behind her, casting long shadows over the winding roads. She wasn't sure where she was going, and that was the point. The road stretched out before her like a promise, leading her away from the hurt and the memories she was trying to forget. As night fell, the landscape around her changed. Trees grew denser, their branches forming a canopy that blotted out the last remnants of daylight. The road narrowed, and the once comforting hum of the engine became the only sound in the stillness. Emily turned up the radio, hoping the music would keep her company, but the signal grew weak, dissolving into static. She sighed and turned it off, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The GPS on her phone had lost signal hours ago, leaving her to navigate by instinct. She had taken a few wrong turns, but she wasn't worried. She had plenty of gas, and she wasn't in a hurry to get anywhere. But as the night deepened, a sense of unease began to settle in her chest. The road seemed unfamiliar, the darkness more oppressive than she had expected. She hadn't seen another car for miles, and the isolation was starting to get to her. She glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 9:30 p.m. She should find a place to stop soon, maybe a motel or even a rest area where she could stretch her legs and get some sleep. But the road ahead remained empty, with no signs of civilization in sight. As she rounded a curve, her headlights caught something on the side of the road, a figure standing just beyond the reach of the light. Emily's heart skipped a beat, her foot hovering over the brake. It was a person, she realized, standing alone in the darkness, their thumb outstretched in a classic hitchhiking gesture. Emily hesitated. Picking up hitchhikers was something she had always been warned against. Too many stories of dangerous encounters and things going wrong. But as she drew closer, she saw that it was a woman, slender and pale, with long, dark hair that framed her face. She wore a long coat that fluttered slightly in the breeze, and her expression was one of desperation. Emily's hesitation wavered. She knew what it felt like to be lost and alone, and something about the woman's appearance tugged at her heart. Maybe it was her own loneliness, or maybe it was the need to feel a connection, even with a stranger. Whatever it was, she found herself pulling over, the car coming to a stop just a few feet from where the woman stood. She rolled down the window, leaning out slightly. "Do you need a ride?" she called, her voice echoing in the stillness. The woman stepped forward, her movements graceful but deliberate. She bent down to peer into the car, her dark eyes meeting Emily's. There was something unsettling about her gaze, something that made Emily's skin prickle, but she couldn't place it. "Yes, please," the woman replied, her voice soft, almost hypnotic. "I've been walking for hours." Emily nodded, unlocking the door. "Hop in." The woman smiled, a brief, enigmatic smile, and opened the passenger door, sliding into the seat beside Emily. She carried no luggage, no bag, just herself and the coat she wore, which she wrapped tightly around her as if to ward off the cold. "Thank you," the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. Not many people would stop. "It's no problem," Emily replied, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "Where are you headed?" "Just down the road," the woman answered vaguely, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. "I'll tell you where to drop me off." Emily nodded, putting the car in gear and pulling back onto the road. The silence between them was thick, almost palpable, and Emily found herself wanting to fill it. "I'm Emily," she offered, glancing at the woman beside her. The woman turned to her, that same small smile on her lips. "It's nice to meet you, Emily. My name is Serena." "What if I don't believe you?" Emily asked, her voice shaking. Serena's gaze didn't waver. "You don't have to, but if you continue on this road, you'll find out the hard way." They drove in silence for a while, the road winding through the dense forest, the trees closing in around them. The night seemed to grow darker, the headlights barely cutting through the thick blackness. Emily kept her eyes on the road, but she could feel Serena's gaze on her, a weight that pressed down on her chest. Finally, unable to take the silence any longer, Emily spoke. "So what brings you out here, Serena? It's not exactly a busy highway." Serena turned her gaze back to the road, her expression unreadable. "I've been traveling for a long time," she said slowly, as if choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes, the road is the only place where I feel at peace." Emily frowned, sensing something deeper in Serena's words, something unsaid. "Are you running from something?" Serena's eyes flickered with something, pain perhaps, or maybe fear, but it was gone before Emily could be sure. "Aren't we all, in one way or another?" Emily didn't know how to respond to that, so she focused. The road seemed to stretch on forever. The darkness thick and suffocating. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were the only two people left in the world, isolated in a bubble of night. Serena broke the silence. "There's something I should tell you." Emily glanced at her, the unease in her chest growing stronger. "What is it?" Serena's voice was calm, almost too calm. "There's a curve in the road ahead. A sharp one. It's easy to miss if you're not paying attention." Emily's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "How do you know that?" Serena's gaze was fixed ahead, her expression distant. "Because I've seen it, in my dreams." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. "In your dreams?" "Yes," Serena said, her voice barely a whisper now. "I've seen this road, this night. I've seen what happens next." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. "What do you mean?" Serena turned to her, her dark eyes locking onto Emily's. "There's going to be an accident, a terrible one. You're going to lose control of the car, and it's going to go off the road, into the trees. We'll survive, but only just." Emily stared at Serena, her blood running cold. What are you talking about?" Serena's expression remained calm, but there was something in her eyes, something that made Emily's skin crawl. "I'm a psychic, Emily. I see things that haven't happened yet, but will. And I've seen this night, this moment." Emily shook her head, trying to dismiss the growing fear in her chest. "This is crazy. You can't know that." Serena didn't blink. "I do, and I'm telling you so you can change it. You have to take the next exit, turn off this road. It's the only way to avoid the crash." Emily's hands trembled on the wheel. This was ridiculous. Serena was just some stranger she had picked up on the side of the road, a hitchhiker with a wild story. But the look in Serena's eyes, the calm certainty in her voice made it hard to dismiss. The road ahead was dark, trees closing in around them like a living tunnel. Emily could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the fear growing with every passing second. Serena's words echoed in her mind, a warning that she couldn't shake. "This is crazy," Emily muttered to herself, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. But even as she said it, she felt a nagging doubt, a tiny voice in the back of her mind telling her that maybe, just maybe, Serena was right. She glanced at Serena, who sat quietly beside her, her hands folded in her lap. There was no fear in her expression, only a calm resignation that sent a chill down Emily's spine. "What happens if I take the exit?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Serena looked at her, her dark eyes filled with something that Emily couldn't quite place. Pity, perhaps, or understanding. "If you take the exit, you'll be safe. You'll avoid the crash, and you'll continue on your journey. But if you don't..." She didn't finish the sentence, but Emily didn't need her to. The implication was clear. The next few minutes passed in tense silence, the car's headlights illuminating the narrow road ahead. Emily's mind raced, torn between skepticism and the growing fear that Serena might be telling the truth. Then, in the distance, she saw it. The exit that Serena had mentioned. A small, barely visible turnoff that led away from the main road and into the unknown. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she approached the exit. Her hands tightened on the wheel, her knuckles white with tension. This was it, the moment of decision. She slowed the car, her foot hovering over the brake pedal. The exit was just ahead, Small, narrow road that disappeared into the darkness. If she took it, she would be safe, or so Serena had said. But if she continued on the main road, her mind flashed to the image of the crash that Serena had described. Car careening off the road, slamming into the trees, the sound of metal crunching and glass shattering. It was too vivid, too real. With a sudden jolt of panic, Emily swerved the car toward the exit. The tires screeched as she made the sharp turn. Car lurching as it left the main road and plunged into the darkness of the side road. For a moment, everything was still. The road ahead was narrow and winding, the trees pressing in on either side. Emily's heart raced, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She had done it. She had avoided the crash. She was safe. But as the car continued down the side road, a new fear began to creep in. The road was unfamiliar, twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. The trees seemed to close in around her, their branches scratching at the car like skeletal fingers. "This doesn't feel right," Emily muttered to herself, her hands shaking on the wheel. Beside her, Serena remained silent, her expression unreadable. The road grew darker, the trees denser, and Emily's unease turned to full-blown fear. She had no idea where she was, no idea where this road was leading her. She felt like she was being led deeper into a trap, away from any chance of escape. Then, without warning, the road came to an abrupt end. Emily slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop just inches from a thick wall of trees. The headlights illuminated the dense foliage, but there was no way forward. We're at a dead end," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Serena didn't respond. She simply stared ahead, her expression calm and detached. Panic surged through Emily's veins. She had taken the exit. She had avoided the crash, so why did it feel like she was in more danger now than ever? She turned to Serena, her voice rising in desperation. "What's going on? Why did you tell me to take this road?" Serena finally looked at her, and the look in her eyes made Emily's blood run cold. There was no pity, no understanding, only a chilling emptiness, like a void that threatened to swallow her whole. "I never said this road would save you," Serena said softly, her voice devoid of emotion. "I only said it would take you away from the crash." Emily's heart pounded in her chest, her mind reeling with the implications of Serena's words. She had been led here, away from one danger and into another, and now there was no way out. In a fit of panic, Emily threw the car into reverse, the tires spinning as she tried to back out of the dead-end road. But the car wouldn't move. It was as if the very ground beneath them had turned to quicksand, holding the car in place. "No, no, no!" Emily cried, slamming her foot on the gas pedal. The car remained stuck, trapped in the darkness of the forest. Serena's voice was calm, almost soothing. "It's no use, Emily. You can't escape what's coming." Emily turned to Serena, her eyes wide with terror. What are you?" Serena's smile was slow, almost predatory. "I'm what you were meant to find on this road. I'm the reason you were brought here." Emily's breath caught in her throat as the full realization of what was happening dawned on her. Serena wasn't a warning. She was the danger. The crash hadn't been the threat. It had been a distraction, something to lure Emily away from the path she should have stayed on. And now, there was no escape. The forest seemed to come alive around them, the trees creaking and groaning as if in response to Serena's presence. Emily could feel the car sinking deeper into the ground, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The air grew thick and oppressive, the silence broken only by the sound of Emily's ragged breathing. Serena's gaze was fixed on Emily, her eyes dark and unblinking. "You were always meant to find me, Emily. This road was never about where you were going, it was about where I needed you to be." Emily's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Why? Why me? Serena's smile was cold, devoid of any warmth. "'Cause you were lost. You were looking for something. An escape, a way out of your pain. And the road gave you what you needed, a chance to find it. But you didn't realize that what you were really looking for was me." Emily's heart pounded in her chest, her fear turning to a deep, gnawing dread. She had been led here, guided by forces she couldn't understand, and now she was trapped, with no way out. "Please," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "Let me go." Serena's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, amusement perhaps, or something darker. "It's too late for that, Emily. The road brought you to me, and now you belong to it." Emily's breath caught in her throat as the full weight of Serena's words settled over her. There was no escape, no way out. She was trapped on this road, with no hope of ever finding her way back. Car continued to sink, the darkness closing in around them. Emily could feel the cold seeping into her bones, the weight of the night pressing down on her. She knew, deep down, that she would never leave this place, that she would become a part of it, just like Serena. Serena leaned closer, her voice a whisper in the darkness. "Don't be afraid, Emily. This is where you were always meant to be." And with those words, the darkness swallowed them whole. When Emily awoke, she was alone. The car was gone, forest silent and still. She lay on the cold, hard ground, the sky above her, a deep, starless black. The road was nowhere in sight, and the only sound was the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. She sat up, her body aching, her mind a haze of confusion and fear. Had it all been a dream? A nightmare conjured by her own mind? But as she looked around, she knew that it hadn't been a dream. The memories of the night were too vivid, too real. Fear, the panic, the sense of being trapped. And Serena had been real. Emily stood, her legs trembling beneath her. She was alone in the forest, with no idea where she was or how to get back. The road had disappeared, leaving her stranded in the middle of nowhere. She took a step forward, then another, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know where she was going, but she had to keep moving. She had to find a way out. But as she walked, forests seemed to close in around her, the trees pressing in from all sides. The darkness was thick and suffocating, the silence oppressive. She felt like she was walking in circles. The trees all looking the same, the path ahead growing more uncertain with every step. And then, in the distance, she saw it. A light, faint and flickering, barely visible through the dense foliage. It was the first sign of anything different, the first glimmer of hope in the endless night. She hurried toward the light, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and relief. But as she drew closer, she realized that the light wasn't what she had hoped for. It was the headlights of a car, buried deep in the trees, its front end crumpled against a thick trunk. The car was old, paint chipped and rusted, the windows shattered. But it was the sight of the driver that made Emily's blood run cold. The body was slumped over the steering wheel, motionless, the face obscured by shadows. But she recognized the coat, the dark hair that fell over the shoulders. It was Serena. Emily stumbled back, her heart racing. This couldn't be real, couldn't be happening. The car was there, the body inside, a grim reminder of the night she had just lived through. She turned and ran, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The forest seemed to close in around her, the darkness thickening, the trees becoming a blur as she fled. But no matter how fast she ran, she couldn't escape the feeling that she was being watched, followed. The sensation of eyes on her back, presence that she couldn't see but could feel with every fiber of her being. She ran until she couldn't run anymore, collapsing to the ground, her body shaking with fear and exhaustion. The darkness closed in around her, the cold seeping into her bones. And then she heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the rustling of leaves or the whisper of a voice. She turned, her heart pounding in her chest, and there, standing just a few feet away, was Serena. But it wasn't the Serena she had met on the road. This Serena was different. Her face was gaunt, her skin pale and almost translucent in the faint light that filtered through the trees. Her eyes, once dark and hypnotic, were now hollow, empty sockets that seemed to swallow the darkness around them. The coat she wore was tattered and stained, fabric hanging off her frame like a shroud. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the figure before her, the terror paralyzing her limbs. This couldn't be real. It had to be a nightmare, a twisted figment of her imagination. But as Serena took a step closer, Emily could feel the icy chill that accompanied her. Coldness that seeped into her very soul. "You can't escape," Serena whispered, her voice a haunting echo that seemed to come from all around. "You were brought here for a reason, Emily. This road is your destiny, just as it was mine." Emily tried to back away, but her body refused to move. It was as if the ground itself was holding her in place, trapping her in the presence of this spectral figure. "Please," she gasped, her voice trembling with fear. "I don't want this. I didn't ask for this." Serena tilted her head as if considering Emily's words. But there was no pity in her expression, no trace of the woman who had once sat beside her in the car. "It doesn't matter what you want," Serena said softly, her voice carrying an eerie finality. "The road has chosen you, just as it chose me. There's no going back." The shadows around them seemed to deepen, the trees looming closer, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Emily could feel the cold creeping up her legs, as if the ground itself was trying to pull her under. She struggled against it, her mind screaming for her to run, fight, to do anything, but succumb to the fate that was closing in on her. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't break free. The darkness pressed in, suffocating her, robbing her of breath and hope. She could feel her strength waning, the fight draining out of her with every passing second. Serena's hollow eyes bore into her, a silent command that resonated deep within Emily's mind. "Accept it," Serena whispered, her voice carrying the weight of countless lost souls. "Embrace the darkness. It's the only way." "No," Emily choked out, tears streaming down her face. I won't become like you." But Serena only smiled. Cold, lifeless smile that held no warmth, no humanity. "You already have," she said, and as the words left her lips, the darkness surged forward, engulfing Emily in its icy embrace. Emily's scream was swallowed by the night, her voice lost in the void as the ground beneath her gave way, pulling her down into the depths of the earth. The coldness seeped into her bones, numbing her body, her mind, her very soul. She could feel herself slipping away, her consciousness fading into the abyss, until there was nothing left, the darkness. When Emily opened her eyes, she was standing in the middle of the road. Forest was gone, trees replaced by the familiar asphalt of the highway she had been driving on just hours before. The sky above was clear, stars twinkling like distant beacons in the night. The air was cool, but not cold, and the oppressive darkness that had surrounded her was nowhere to be found. For a moment she thought it had all been a dream, a horrific, vivid nightmare that had left her shaken but unharmed. But as she looked around, she realized that something was wrong. The road was empty, silent, with no sign of her car or the wrecked vehicle she had seen in the woods. There was no sound, no movement, nothing to indicate that she was anywhere near civilization. She was alone. Her heart pounded in her chest as she took a hesitant step forward, her mind racing to make sense of what had happened. Had she somehow survived? Had she escaped the nightmare that had tried to claim her? But as she walked, the unease began to grow. The road stretched on endlessly, the landscape around her remaining static, unchanging. It was as if she was trapped in a loop, doomed to walk the same stretch of highway over and over again. And then she saw it, figure standing in the distance, silhouetted against the night sky. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the familiar outline, the long coat, the dark hair. It was Serena. Emily froze, her body trembling with fear. She had escaped, she was sure of it. But here was Serena, standing in the middle of the road, waiting for her. How could this be possible? Slowly, Serena began to walk toward her, her movements deliberate, almost mechanical. There was no rush, no urgency, only a quiet inevitability that sent a chill down Emily's spine. "You can't run from it," Serena said, her voice carrying across the distance between them. "No matter how far you go, the road will always bring you back." Emily's mind raced, desperate for a way out, but she knew, deep down, there was no escape. She was trapped, bound to this road just as Serena had been, caught in a cycle that would never end. As Serena drew closer, Emily felt the coldness return, seeping into her skin, freezing her in place. She could see Serena's face now, the hollow eyes, the pale skin, the expressionless mask that had once been human. "You belong to the road now," Serena whispered, her voice a death knell. "Just like I do, just like we all do." Emily wanted to scream, fight, do anything to break free of the fate that was closing in on her. But the darkness was already seeping in, clouding her vision, numbing her senses. She could feel herself being pulled back, drawn into the same void that had claimed Serena and so many others before her. And as the last remnants of light faded from her world, Emily understood the truth. She had never escaped, she had never been free. The road had claimed her, just as it had claimed Serena, and there was no way out. With one final, shuddering breath, Emily surrendered to the darkness, her body collapsing to the cold, unforgiving ground. The road stretched out before her, endless and unyielding, path that she would walk for all eternity. And somewhere in the distance, Serena smiled. Emily was never seen again, and the road continued to wind through the dark forest, waiting for its next traveler. But those who passed by sometimes claimed to see a figure standing by the side of the road. Pale woman with hollow eyes and a long coat, her thumb outstretched in a silent plea for a ride. Those who were brave or foolish enough to stop and offer her a ride were never seen again. The road claimed them, just as it had claimed Emily, Serena, and countless others before them. And so the road remained, a cursed path that lured the lost and the desperate, feeding on their hopes and fears, drawing them into its endless embrace. Because in the end, the road always wins. It was a cold Friday night in late October. The air had that distinct chill, kind that sinks into your bones and makes you pull your coat tighter around you. Halloween was just a few days away, and the streets were already decked out with skeletons, cobwebs, and jack-o'-lanterns. It was the perfect night to see a horror movie, and my friends and I had planned this outing weeks in advance. I arrived at the theater first, like I always did. The Marquise Theater was an old place, one of those small, single-screen venues that had been around since the 1950s. It had character, though, kind of charm that the big multiplexes just couldn't replicate. I loved the place, even if it did have a bit of a creepy vibe. As I stood in the lobby, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly overhead, I checked my phone for the time. 7:10 p.m. We had agreed to meet at 7 p.m. sharp, and Megan had already texted me that she was on her way. But Rachel, she was late, and that was odd. Rachel was never late. Where's Rachel? Megan's voice cut through the low murmur of the lobby. She had just arrived, her breath visible in the cold air as she stepped inside. I don't know, I replied, slipping my phone back into my pocket. She hasn't texted me or anything. Megan shrugged, pulling off her gloves and stuffing them into her coat pocket. Maybe she got stuck in traffic or something. I nodded. Something felt off. Rachel was always the one to remind us of plans, to make sure everyone was on time. It wasn't like her to be late without a word. We waited for another 10 minutes, chatting idly about work and the movie we were about to see. It was a new horror film, one that had been getting a lot of buzz for its eerie atmosphere and shocking twists. We were all horror buffs, so we were excited to see if it lived up to the hype. Just as Megan was about to suggest going inside and saving Rachel a seat, the door to the theater lobby creaked open. We both turned to see Rachel step inside, her long dark hair hanging limply around her face. She was wearing her usual black coat. Something about her seemed different. Hey Rachel. We were starting to worry, I called out, waving her over. Rachel looked up at us, and for a moment I swore her eyes looked wrong. They were dull, almost lifeless. Her skin seemed paler than usual. She gave a weak smile and walked toward us, her steps slow and deliberate. Sorry, I'm late, she said in a flat, almost monotone voice. No worries, Megan said, though I could tell she noticed something was off too. We're just glad you made it. We didn't press her on why she was late. Felt awkward, like something was hanging in the air that neither of us wanted to acknowledge. Instead, we all headed into the theater, handed our tickets to the bored-looking teenager at the counter, and found seats in the middle row. As we sat down, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with Rachel. She was unusually quiet, barely saying a word as the previews played. Normally, she'd be chatting excitedly about the movie or making fun of the cheesy ads, but tonight, she just stared straight ahead, hands folded in her lap. Are you okay? I whispered, leaning closer to her as the lights dimmed. Rachel turned her head slowly to look at me. Her eyes were still that strange, dull color, and her expression was blank. I'm fine, she replied, but her voice was hollow, like she was speaking from far away. I nodded, though I didn't believe her. But what was I supposed to say? Something about her was really creeping me out, but I didn't want to ruin the night by pushing her. Maybe she was just tired or not feeling well. I decided to let it go, hoping she'd snap out of it once the movie started. The movie was good, really good. The kind that builds tension slowly, leaving you on the edge of your seat the whole time. The theater was almost empty, just a few other people scattered throughout the seats. It made the experience even creepier, like we were all alone in that dark room, with only the flickering images on the screen to keep us company. But as the movie went on, I found it hard to focus. My mind kept drifting back to Rachel. Every time I glanced over at her, she was just sitting there, staring blankly at the screen. She didn't react to the jump scares, didn't flinch during the intense scenes. It was like she wasn't really there. Megan noticed it too. She leaned over to me during a particularly tense moment and whispered, "What's up with her?" I just shook my head. I didn't know, and honestly, I didn't want to think about it. Something about Rachel's behavior was making my skin crawl, and I just wanted the movie to be over so we could leave. Finally, the credits rolled and the lights came up. The three of us stood up and filed out of the theater in silence. Megan and I exchanged nervous glances, but Rachel just walked ahead of us, her steps slow and deliberate, like she was moving through a dream. "Hey, do you guys want to grab a drink or something?" Megan asked, trying to break the tension as we stepped out into the cold night air. Rachel shook her head. "I think I'll just head home," she said, her voice still that strange, flat tone. "Are you sure?" I asked, a knot forming in my stomach. "We can hang out for a bit if you want." But Rachel just shook her head again. "No, I'm tired. I'll see you guys later." With that, she turned and started walking down the street, figure disappearing into the darkness. Megan and I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Finally, Megan broke the silence. "That was weird, right?" "Yeah," I agreed, my voice barely above a whisper. "Something's not right with her." "Maybe we should call her tomorrow, check in on her," Megan suggested. I nodded. "Yeah, good idea." We said our goodbyes, and I started walking home. The streets were quiet, with only the occasional car passing by. The cold air bit at my cheeks, and I shoved my hands deeper into my pockets, trying to ward off the chill. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. The street behind me was empty. Still, the feeling persisted, and I quickened my pace, eager to get home. By the time I reached my apartment, I was practically running. I slammed the door shut behind me, my heart pounding in my chest. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. It was just my imagination, I told myself. The movie had gotten to me, that's all. But even as I tried to calm down, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. Something was wrong, and it had to do with Rachel. I pulled out my phone, intending to text her, but before I could type out a message, my phone rang. It was Megan. "Hey," I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Alyssa." Megan's voice was shaky, barely more than a whisper. "You're not going to believe this." "What? What's wrong?" I asked, my heart pounding again. "It's Rachel," she said, her voice trembling. She was in an accident this afternoon, a car accident. "Alyssa, she's dead." I felt the blood drain from my face. "What? No, that's impossible. We just saw her. We just watched a movie with her." "I know," Megan said, her voice breaking, "but I just got a call from her mom. She was killed instantly, around 4 p.m. today." I staggered back, my mind reeling. "No, that can't be. We were just with her, Megan. We were just with her." "I don't know what's going on, Alyssa," Megan whispered, "but whoever or whatever was with us tonight, it wasn't Rachel." I felt like I was going to be sick. My head was spinning, and I could barely comprehend what Megan was saying. Rachel was dead. She had been dead for hours. But if that was true, then who had we seen at the theater? As I stood there, trying to make sense of it all, I heard a noise. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it sent a chill down my spine. It was the sound of a doorbell ringing. I turned slowly, my eyes locking onto the front door. The bell rang again, louder this time, more insistent. Megan was still on the phone, her voice frantic in my ear. "Alyssa, are you there? What's happening?" "I don't know," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Someone's at the door." "Don't open it," Megan said urgently. "Alyssa, don't open the door." I didn't need her to tell me that. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to stay away, to run, to hide. I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, my eyes glued to the door. The bell rang again, and this time it was accompanied by a soft, almost hesitant knock. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. Slowly, as if in a trance, I stepped toward the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the peephole. "Alyssa, no." Megan's voice was desperate now, but it felt distant, like it was coming from far away. I pressed my eye to the peephole, my breath catching in my throat. And there, standing on the other side of the door, was Rachel. She looked exactly as she had at the theater, pale with those dull, lifeless eyes. But now, up close, I could see that there was something horribly wrong with her. Her skin was too pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, they were empty, devoid of any life or emotion. She stared straight ahead, her expression blank, as if she was waiting for something. Waiting for me. I stumbled back from the door, my heart racing. "Megan." "She's here," I whispered, my voice trembling. No, that's not Rachel," Megan said, her voice breaking. "Alyssa, get out of there. Now." But I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of sick joke, or a hallucination, or... The doorbell rang again, and this time I could hear Rachel's voice, muffled through the door. "Alyssa, let me in." Her voice was soft, almost pleading, but there was something wrong with it. It was like listening to a recording, just slightly off, not quite human. "Alyssa," Megan was shouting now, trying to snap me out of my trance. "Run. Get out of there." But I couldn't. I was frozen. My eyes locked on the door as the handle began to turn, slowly, as if Rachel, or whatever was pretending to be Rachel, was testing to see if it was locked. I backed away, my mind screaming at me to move, to do something, but my body wouldn't listen. The handle jiggled again, harder this time, and I could hear Rachel's voice, more insistent now. "Alyssa, please, I'm cold. Let me in." Tears streamed down my face as I turned and ran toward the back door, my heart pounding in my chest. I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get it open. Finally, I wrenched the door open and ran out into the night, not daring to look back. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing onto the cold ground, as my mind raced to make sense of what had just happened. My thoughts were a tangled mess of fear, confusion, and disbelief. I couldn't comprehend what I had just seen, what I had just heard. Rachel was dead. She had been dead for hours. Yet she was at my door, calling my name, begging to be let in. The wind howled through the trees as I lay there on the cold ground, shivering not just from the chill in the air, but from the overwhelming terror that gripped me. I reached for my phone, still clutched in my trembling hand, and brought it to my ear. "Megan," I gasped, barely able to get the words out. "Megan, I saw her. She was at my door." There was a moment of silence on the other end, and I could hear Megan breathing heavily as if she were running. "Alyssa, listen to me," she said, her voice filled with urgency. "You need to get out of there, get somewhere safe. I'm coming to get you." I struggled to my feet, my legs wobbly and unsteady. "Where are you?" I asked, my voice shaking as I stumbled forward, trying to put as much distance between myself and my apartment as possible. "I'm about 5 minutes away," Megan replied. "Stay on the phone with me, okay? Just keep talking to me." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me, and forced myself to keep moving. The streets were eerily quiet, the houses dark and silent, as if the whole neighborhood had gone to sleep early. But I knew better. I knew something was out there. Something that had taken Rachel's form. Something that wasn't human. As I walked, my mind kept replaying the events of the night over and over. Rachel's odd behavior at the theater, the lifeless look in her eyes, the way she moved like she was in a daze. And then that voice at my door, so familiar yet so wrong. I shuddered, trying to push the thoughts away. But they kept coming back, relentless and terrifying. What had we seen at the theater? Who, no, what, had we been sitting next to? My heart pounded in my chest as I heard footsteps behind me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The footsteps were soft, barely audible, but they were there, growing closer with each passing second. "Megan," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Someone's following me." "Keep moving," Megan urged. "Don't stop, Alyssa. I'm almost there." I forced myself to move again, my pace quickening as the footsteps grew louder. I didn't dare look back, didn't dare see what or who was behind me. My only thought was to get away, to get to safety. Finally, I reached the end of the street, and I could see the headlights of Megan's car approaching. Relief flooded through me, but it was quickly replaced by a new wave of fear as I heard the footsteps break into a run, sprinting toward me. I broke into a run myself, my legs pumping as I raced toward Megan's car. I could see her now, her face pale and frightened as she leaned out the window, shouting my name. "Alyssa, get in!" I didn't need to be told twice. I reached the car and flung open the door, throwing myself inside just as something, cold, clammy hand brushed against my shoulder. I screamed, slamming the door shut behind me, and Megan floored the gas pedal, the car lurching forward as we sped away. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my mind still reeling from what had just happened. Megan's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white, her eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. "Are you okay?" she finally asked, voice shaky. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Megan, what the hell is going on? Who? What was that?" Megan shook her head, her expression grim. "I don't know, Alyssa, but whatever it is, it's not Rachel. Can't be. Rachel's gone." Her words sent a chill down my spine, and I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see that thing chasing us down the road. But there was nothing there, just the dark, empty street stretching out behind us. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice trembling. "My place," Megan replied. "It's closer, and I don't want to risk going back to yours." I nodded, grateful that Megan was thinking clearly, as I certainly wasn't. My mind was a jumble of fear and confusion, and all I could think about was the way Rachel had looked at the theater, the way her eyes had seemed so dead. We drove in silence for a while, the tension in the car thick and suffocating. Finally, Megan pulled into the driveway of her small, cozy house. The lights were on inside, a warm glow spilling out into the night. It should have been comforting, but instead, it felt ominous. Like something was waiting for us in the shadows. We hurried inside, locking the door behind us and double-checking the windows. Megan's house was small, just a single story with a few rooms, but it felt like a fortress compared to the dark streets outside. We collapsed onto the couch in the living room, both of us too shaken to speak. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of our breathing. Finally, Megan spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Alyssa, what did you see?" I shook my head, my mind racing. "I don't know. I saw Rachel, but it wasn't her. It couldn't have been. She was dead, but she was there, at my door, calling my name." I trailed off, unable to continue. The memory of Rachel's lifeless eyes sent a shiver down my spine, and I hugged myself, trying to ward off the cold that had settled deep in my bones. Megan didn't say anything for a long time, just sat there staring at the floor. Finally, she looked up at me, her eyes wide with fear. "Alyssa, what if it's not just Rachel? What if whatever that was, what if it can be anyone?" The thought hit me like a punch to the gut. If that thing could take on Rachel's form, what was stopping it from taking on someone else's? What if it was already someone we knew, someone close to us? I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could say anything, there was a loud, insistent knock on the door. We both froze, our eyes locked on the door. The knock came again, louder this time, more demanding. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could see the same fear in Megan's eyes that I felt in my own. Neither of us moved. The knock came again, and then we heard a voice, a familiar voice. "Megan? Alyssa? It's me, Rachel. Let me in." My blood ran cold. It was her voice, no doubt about it, but we both knew it couldn't be her. It wasn't her. Megan shook her head, her face pale. "Don't open it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Whatever you do, don't open the door." I nodded, my body trembling with fear. The knocking continued, more insistent now, and Rachel's voice grew more desperate. "Please, let me in. It's so cold out here." I clamped my hands over my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. Her voice was everywhere, echoing in my mind, sending chills down my spine. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for it to stop, for her to go away. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse, thick and oppressive, like the calm before a storm. I slowly opened my eyes and looked at Megan. She was staring at the door, her face white as a sheet. "Do you think she's gone?" I whispered. "I don't know," Megan replied, her voice barely audible. "I don't want to find out." We sat there in silence, neither of us daring to move. Minutes passed, then an hour, but it felt like an eternity. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, Megan spoke, her voice shaky. "We can't stay here. We need to get out of town, go somewhere far away." I nodded, knowing she was right. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. And I had a feeling what it wanted was us. We packed quickly, throwing clothes and essentials into a couple of bags. Megan grabbed her car keys, and we headed for the door. But just as Megan reached for the handle, there was another knock. This one soft, almost hesitant. My heart leaped into my throat, and I grabbed Megan's arm, pulling her back. "Don't," I whispered urgently. "It's not her." Megan nodded, her face pale with fear. We stood there, frozen in place, as the knock came again, followed by Rachel's voice. "Megan, Alyssa? Please, I'm so cold." Her voice was different this time. Softer, almost sad. It tugged at my heartstrings, making me want to believe that maybe, just maybe, it really was Rachel out there, lost and alone, desperate to come inside. But I knew better. Deep down, I knew. "Megan," I whispered, my voice trembling, "we have to go, now." She nodded again, and without another word, we turned and headed for the back door. We were almost there when the knocking started again. Louder this time, more frantic. "Don't leave me. Please, don't leave me out here." I felt a pang of guilt, but I shoved it aside. Whatever was out there, it wasn't Rachel. Couldn't be. Rachel was gone. We reached the back door, and Megan fumbled with the lock, hands shaking. Finally, she got it open, and we stepped outside into the cold night air. We didn't look back as we hurried to the car. Not even when we heard the knocking start again, followed by Rachel's voice, now filled with desperation. "Please, don't go. I need you. Please." We got in the car, and Megan started the engine, her hands trembling as she gripped the steering wheel. We pulled out of the driveway and sped down the road, leaving the house and whatever was at the door behind us. As we drove, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Rachel standing in the road, watching us leave. There was nothing, just the dark, empty street stretching out behind us. We didn't stop driving until we were miles out of town, the city lights far behind us. Only then did Megan pull over to the side of the road, her hand still gripping the wheel, her knuckles white. We sat there in silence for a long time, neither of us knowing what to say. Finally, Megan spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Alyssa, what do we do now?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we couldn't go back, not now, not ever. Whatever was out there, it wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted, and I wasn't sure we could outrun it forever. But as I looked at Megan, I knew one thing for sure. We had to try. "We keep going," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "We keep running until we're safe." Megan nodded, and without another word, she started the car again. We drove off into the night, leaving everything we knew behind us. But as we sped down the dark, empty road, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That whatever was out there, whatever had taken Rachel's form, was still following us, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. And I knew, deep down, that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because some things, once they find you, never let you go.